is my pleasure to introduce Grant Boykin. He is a software engineering manager of cloud governance at Capital One. He's been in technology since 2013 and survived a huge enterprise cloud migration. He's an engineer within auto finance at Capital One and now leads a cloud governance team that optimizes cost, access, and all the things. Go ahead, Grant.
Thank you. How do I sound? Volume good? Okay, cool. So yeah, I didn't realize he was going to do the entire bio intro, but let's get going anyway. So as you can see, the title of my presentation is a bit long-winded. As a dev, I hated governance, but now it's my job, and it sort of personifies the governance journey that I've been exposed to at my company, and how that went, and eventually how I went from a non-technical role to eventually a technical one. But yeah, let's get going here. So quick intro about myself. Yeah, looks like the clicker's a bit sensitive. Okay. I graduated from Texas A&M in 2013 with a MIS degree, Management Information Systems, for those who aren't familiar with that acronym. Been in, like he said, I've been in tech for close to 10 years, all with the same company. So right after college, I started working for Capital One, and I'm still working there, surprisingly. A bit rare in the tech field these days, I feel like. But yeah, I've been in their ecosystem since they were in data centers, to the point now where we're completely out of them and fully operate in AWS. I started out as a business systems analyst first. That was kind of like my first gig out of college, in the financial services space. And for those who aren't familiar with that one, that's kind of like a pseudo product owner who would take business requirements and essentially translate them into technical requirements for the application teams to deliver to various customers. After about 2 years, I transitioned into a more of an engineering role, sort of in the environment management space is what we called it anyway. But it was essentially writing scripts to restart servers, ensure various services are up. So kind of like a sysadmin gig for in an on-prem world. Eventually in 2014, our company started their cloud migration, and my team at the time had changed quite a bit. So I went from more of a sysadmin role to eventually today, being more involved in technical governance and delivering utilities that kind of support those fashions. Like I said, eventually I got my own cloud governance team, and we're essentially responsible for creating various tools to keep our cloud well managed, drive cost saving initiatives, because everybody knows that the cloud burns money like no other, depending on what you're doing. We want to ensure that everybody's resources that they deploy and manage in the cloud adhere to very stringent standards, because I'm sure everybody hears of all the data breaches and other various security incidents that that go on today. Some fun facts about me. I enjoy racket sports, so badminton, tennis, pickleball, racquetball. Played them all. Enjoy those quite a bit. Heavy enjoyer of cartoons. Hopefully there's some anime fans in the crowd, who knows. A bit of a Magic the Gathering nerd. Thank you. I'm also a Chihuahua dad. This is my Chihuahua Naomi. She's kind of my world, and she's pretty awesome. I'm also a whiskey and bourbon lover. At the speaker dinner last night, I got a chance to try some Chattanooga whiskey, which was surprisingly good. So after I'm done, if anybody has any good local recommendations, I would love to talk or answer questions you may have. And so before I jump in here, this is kind of setting the context, but most of the time when I'm referring to governance in this presentation, I'm referring to cloud governance, specifically within the Amazon Web Services space. Usually those principles and themes can still be applied to other common platforms like GCP or Azure. And I'm not plugging any of the technology I'm mentioning in this presentation. I'm not trying to market or sell you things. So please don't interpret that in that way. But yeah, like I mentioned earlier, this kind of journey is kind of just exemplifies what I've been exposed to in my career so far. So let's do a quick poll. How many people in the room at some point in their life had their parents nag them to clean their room, mow the lawn, edge the lawn, anything like that? So yeah, quite a few people. And the analogy I'm trying to make here is, we've all been on those. We've all been on teams where we've been bugged by various governance teams, compliance teams, you name it. We've been exposed to it. Nobody likes getting bugged to fix things that don't necessarily provide immediate value. So that's kind of how I'm starting this. Second poll. In the prior Christmas or prior holiday season, does anybody remember this infamous security incident that happened? How many people's holidays were interrupted by this? Yeah, so we got quite a few in the room. But yeah, so when I jumped into software engineering, like in the professional world, I thought I had escaped the nagging, but little do I know, I was completely wrong. Once I transitioned into that phase, I was always being pulled away, sidetracked by other teams telling me I need to fix various vulnerabilities, security configurations, proper secret management, all kinds of those things, right? It's vastly overwhelming for any human to kind of process all of these things and deliver on them in an effective manner. And it's a constant struggle of tech, right? Because tech's evolving so fast these days. And I would say like a common reaction that most people have to this nagging is to essentially do as little as possible to remediate whatever requirement it is and get moving on to the next deliverable. And developers also tend to cheat the system whenever they can. If it's less work in the long run, even though there may eventually be repercussions later down the road. But usually, if there's a way to get around a problem, we'll code around it, even if it's not like the best direction at the time. And I'm sure most people in the room have been in those shoes. And even I've done it, and I'm sitting up here giving a governance talk. So you live and you learn, I guess. But yeah, so like I was mentioning earlier, this is essentially the eternal struggle, right? Like it's never ending. We hate being bugged by all of these sister teams that want us to fix these problems, and essentially it feels like they might not be pulling their weight, but they should be helping us fix these things or automating them. But the reality is everybody is kind of at a different stage in their governance journey. So it's important to realize, that when you're thinking about these things. And obviously in a environment that's regulated like the financial sector, which I'm in, there's a lot more rules and fun things you have to adhere to. So those obviously apply here. And I like early in my career, I never really had an appreciation for governance teams. It always felt like they didn't understand, my team or our goals or timelines. I would push back whenever possible, and eventually that would, cause fire drills to happen later. Everybody loves getting, pinged at 4:45 on a Friday, right? And having to jump on something, and nobody enjoys that, right? So the even more interesting part that I kind of realized is I wasn't the only person on my team that was, having these opinions. It was kind of like the norm, right? We would be deprioritizing these various governance requests and things that would come into our team. My ecosystem was a bit less governed back then, but still, it was interesting to me that basically the entire team had the same kind of negative opinion or negative connotation with governance in general. And so what I'm going through here is kind of like my some essential bad practices that I saw earlier in my career. And the first one I'll hit on is kind of the copy paste syndrome. Everybody uses Stack Overflow. We steal stuff all the time. This is a very common thing, but I want to take a step back for a second because that's not necessarily like what I'm talking about here. It's less about borrowing source code from Stack Overflow and more about being cognizant of copying like various governance related things like IAM policy code or S3 bucket policy code or like anything in the resource policy space within AWS. If you don't understand the fundamentals behind it, you could be copying something that is highly over-provisioned for what you need to do. And you know how the syndrome works, right? Like you copy one thing, somebody asks you how you did that thing, you give them what you did, and the next thing you know, like 100 teams are leveraging the same over-provisioned IAM code, and a year down the road, your company may dictate that you need to go fix all those things. So, I mean, it may be the same, the same fix for all 100 teams, but still, it's a huge waste of time, right? And it's also good to be cautious when you're copying code from various guides or documentation. Even AWS, the pinnacle cloud provider, if you will, earlier in their kind of inception, like some of their docs would essentially tell their users to, it would give them like a policy that would essentially do everything under the sun. And they said, this works, you can use it. And that is highly over-provisioned for what most people are trying to do. The next one I'll hit on is one of my favorites, right? Like I'm just gonna share this resource, use it for my needs when another team is doing it, or like spinning something up on that resource. So like typically sharing resources on-prem is quite different from the cloud, right? I can't tell you how many times I have seen chaos erupt from teams sharing things like an S3 bucket, running task definitions on a shared ECS cluster, or sharing an IAM role. By doing those things, you essentially open yourself up to a bigger blast radius, more breaking changes, events that are difficult to troubleshoot that could have been avoided if you were just using your own role or your own infrastructure. And obviously there's arguments, that can be back and forth in this space, like if it's a similar architecture or whatnot, but generally from my experience, it's always good to kind of separate and delineate those things. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen like different applications sharing an IAM role, it gets deleted, they suddenly all break and they're blaming each other because you pressed the delete button. Why'd you delete that? I was using it. I mean, how does that team know that you're using that thing, right? You should not be sharing those things. And the next one here is not tagging resources. This is a recipe for disaster in the cloud. I'll give you one example with SNS topics earlier in our cloud journey when people were creating these things. For those who don't know, SNS, Simple Notification Service, essentially a way for APIs to send messages to each other, first in, first out, that kind of stuff, push notifications. So basically a simple notification. And teams were creating these topics, these SNS topics left and right? And none of them were tagged. We had no governance controls in place, to enforce people to actually tag these things. Eventually led to thousands of these various topics across our ecosystem, some used, some not. So we basically had to we had a governance requirement that all these things had to be tagged, they had to be linked to an application, right? So how do you do that? You have to get creative and ultimately essentially like analyze the traffic that's going through them, examining the subscriptions that are on these things. It was a very manual process, and we got it done, but it was a huge effort. So obviously want to avoid this if we can. And I'll transition to kind of like the product/business viewpoint, whatever you want to call it here. But essentially, as a developer, you're taking orders from your product people. You're delivering on X, Y, Z, and if you need to take a shortcut, lots of people do it. It typically starts with, I'm just going to do this thing one time. It's almost always more than one time though, right? And I'll give you an example here. You're developing on an API, you need to integrate somewhere, you need to open connectivity, right? Like you need to change some rules on your security group. Manually adding a rule through the console is, I would call that a bad practice, but I've seen it done more times than I can count. Whereas you should be going through sort of a more governance-related system there. And, say that person shares what they did to fix that connectivity problem, right? It's kind of like the replication just starts from there, and next thing you know, you have 10 people manually adding, essentially the entire internet to come into their application, right? Like that's terrible. We don't want that. Nobody wants that. You expose yourself to so much attack vectors by doing something like that. And I mean, so usually product and business, they don't have the foresight to understand the implications of these shortcuts that I'm referencing, right? They're kind of leaning on their technical people to make those decisions. Sometimes they don't even know what they are, or they may mention it in like a grooming or something, but they kind of view that as low risk, whereas the engineer may have a bit more context into the repercussions down the line for such a thing. But yes, these eventually lead to large amounts of tech debt that we all know and love, right? And it just gets bigger and bigger, and next thing you know, you have an entire PI or an entire sprint to catch up on this all these remediation activities and fire drills that are going to happen. So now that I've covered kind of some of the negative things that I experienced as a developer, right? Like moving into a governance role, I moved to the dark side, if you will, as Grumpy Cat is showing you here. But ultimately, I did switch to a more governance technical role, and I was very curious because it was an opportunity to kind of be on the other side of things and to understand where those teams and those people come from. Because obviously, once you're exposed to both sides, being an engineer on one side, developing a product versus being an engineer or a leader in the governance space and developing those products and how it all ties together, right? It enabled me to see things through a different lens, and ultimately, once you get exposed to both of those things, it allows you to kind of enable a more well-managed software environment, if you will. And this slide essentially covers some of my own misconceptions throughout the process. I was definitely hesitant to make this career move into governance because I had always been on the other side. I didn't want to immediately become that guy that was bugging all of these application teams, right? Like nobody wants to be that person that is always telling you that you did something wrong. So, however, I was still curious to see where those people were coming from, so I could succeed in my new role and possibly change the viewpoint of how it was of how other people saw it. But yeah, I started to understand the wider implications of cutting all these corners, and began to get exposed to a wide variety of other types of teams that handle various vulnerabilities, security, compliance, etc. And I started to understand that most of these requirements were there to protect us, right? And not all the time, they don't demonstrate that. One example is what our internal red team, like the white hat hackers, if you will, they would come by and essentially say this thing had to be fixed in a week, no matter what, because of the criticality of the vulnerability, and they wouldn't give us context into why this needed to be fixed. Like you need to provide that context in order to. Communication is a two-way street, right? So. But yeah, so the flip side of some of these, some of these things, sharing is caring. No, it's not. If you have a few components that live together and with similar architecture, sure. But otherwise, we need to be separating these things because ultimately it drives problems with cost and ownership and In the cloud, those are not fun problems to solve. Excuse me. But yeah, if you're sharing these resources, you open your applications up to the same risk and outages that could affect whoever you're sharing with. And obviously, we don't want to do that. And yeah, for the love of all things cloud, please tag your stuff. This is like one of the easier governance models to implement, I think. You can come up with, a simple standard, like for all your EC2s, you put these 3 tags on it. It defines ownership, and you can grab metadata and all that stuff and do various things with cost, and you ensure that all your cloud resources are essentially, they have proper owners. I can't tell you, how many times I've found this, P39X double XL instance that costs, like $500 an hour to run, and it's not tagged, and you're like, well, I'm just going to delete this thing because they're not following our rules. I mean, please tag your stuff, guys. Please do that. And with that, you can help enforce rules on engineers to prevent bad practices like the one I just mentioned. When you combine it with other governance tools like Cloud Custodian, for example, it kind of gives you a unique way to spin your resources up and down on demand to reduce cost and other things like that. This is one of my favorite topics because I've done quite a few remediation efforts in the IAM space. But yeah, as most of y'all probably know, a huge percentage of cloud security incidents are in some way tied to overly permissive machine and human policies within the IAM space. And obviously, you always want to go for least privilege when possible, right? It reduces your blast radius. It reduces the amount of tools that need access to everything, like Splunk or other monitoring mechanisms. A lot of people have misconceptions about how trust policies actually work on IAM roles, and it's a little confusing. I won't go into that right now, but it is something to look up on if you're unfamiliar with how those work. And using conditionals where you can is obviously always good because you're essentially, reducing the amount of risk you're exposing yourself to. And yeah, you'd be surprised at how often something that has good intentions in the security or monitoring space is often like one of the critical faults in a breach or a cloud security incident because of a misconfiguration or something along those lines. And I'll kind of give an example here. Say we had a utility in place to protect our external websites in the cloud. This utility was, automated in some way to where it was pulling some configuration files from S3 down, and it had a very over-provisioned IAM role in each of our AWS accounts. So, in the event that utility ever got exploited, like they would have access to tons of buckets with probably, potentially bad data in them that we wouldn't want to get into nefarious hands. And that IAM role, for one thing, was replicated across all of our accounts, and it had basically any S3 access you can think of to any bucket in our accounts. So bad news bears, not good. It's also kind of important to understand the shared security model that these cloud providers, live by, because in the end, we're all responsible for kind of those things. So taking a step back here, and because obviously there's kind of a negative connotation with governance, right? Like most people view it as a hassle. As a developer, it's kind of impossible to know all of these things, and you really should be embracing others' expertise when possible instead of ignoring them. And if they're not giving you context, obviously try and probe them. Be curious. Like, why am I fixing this thing? Make them state their reasoning, and eventually, you'll understand the emphasis behind that reasoning. And usually, these governance teams and these compliance teams are usually looking out for you and not bugging you just for the sake of it. They're like an additional safety net in the grand scheme of things and help keep your company headline out of the news, which is the ultimate goal, right? And strategic alignment between governance and larger business goals is, a key to kind of this governance journey in any organization. The earlier you start, the less tech debt you're going to have later because, you're reducing the amount of bad practices that get in the long run. And obviously, some of these things are sweeping changes, so they require a push from the top approach. So it's always good when you have somebody more technical in those leadership roles that can kind of, use their experience to push those initiatives down. So now that y'all have kind of, been with me throughout our governance journey, like what do we actually do? I've talked a lot about, bad practices and things like that, but these are some of the things that, my team delivers and works on. And so obviously we want to prevent software, storage, infrastructure misconfigurations. Those obviously contribute to a large number of security incidents. S3 is a huge one in this space because you can click a button on the console and make your bucket on the internet. And some people click on that and they, to get their application to work, and they're happy, but they don't realize they've just exposed their data to anybody who knows that bucket name, right? Policies themselves can also be a little bit confusing at the beginning, but I mentioned cloud custodian earlier, but this is another mechanism that we use to kind of save cost in our cloud and manage our resources in a unique manner. It's an open source tool, so check it out if you want. But essentially, it gives engineers the ability to manage their cloud resources in more customized ways. And an example there is like if you only need your EC2 instances or your RDS instances running during the business hours, right? Like you can put tags on your resources to indicate that. So custodian will turn your stuff off at night and bring it back up in the morning. So you're all that money and time you're saving is essentially baked in there. So the resources are running 24/7. Obviously, that's a different story in production, right? But as you mature, you can eventually get there to where you may realize that your prod stuff doesn't need to be up 24/7. Making IAM easy. So like I said earlier, I've done very large remediation efforts in the IAM space within AWS, and it's obviously very challenging because there's so many different permissions, so many different services, thousands of different actions in these policies. And it's hard to determine what you need versus like what you actually need, right? Thankfully, there's lots of data-driven resources here that can be utilized. And AWS has actually gotten a lot better recently with their Access Advisor mechanism. So it can give you some insight into what you've been doing and things like that. But you obviously always want to shoot for least privilege in this space because it'll save you down the road essentially. Takeaways. Governance is not out to get you, even though it may seem like it is. And it's not intended to make your job more complicated. It's there to keep your company's name out of the headlines. Because when that happens, it's no bueno. Starting your governance journey early benefits everyone and can save extensive time and money in the long run. It helps keep an eye on cost as that can get out of control very quickly in the cloud. And my final point here, tag your SHIT. You'll thank me later. In closing, always make sure you are conveying the why when you're asking somebody to do something. And this can be outside of the technical realm, right? Like, make sure they understand where you're coming from. And this concept can be applied to almost anything. Communication is a two-way street, and once the other person understands, then y'all are more likely to succeed as a group. And your parents weren't nagging you just to be a nuisance or make your life more difficult. It's not just about cleaning your room or doing that task that they told you to. It's about how it all fits together to make a well-managed household, or a cloud in this case. And that's it. Thank you, guys.
All right, thanks so much. We actually have a little bit of time for questions if anybody has any. All right, we're going right here.
Sure. So how do you how do you recommend implementing governance on the people that can create the infrastructure, like people with admin level access, like so that they are implementing things that are following the guidelines? So, like, do you recommend like multiple accounts for different projects, or what is your recommendation on that?
Yeah, so when I think of that admin access you mentioned, I kind of think of like that kind of equates to the core user in AWS, which is essentially, in some cases, like a profile that has access to all accounts in your organization. When you use something like custodian or another governance mechanism that enforces rules on various resource creation, I'll give you an example. Like you can stop people from creating certain types of instances or deploying lambdas that aren't in a VPC or things like that. So once you have those rules in all of your accounts and they're driven from kind of the top down, it enforces those rules on everybody, even the admins. So they still need to tag their stuff. They're not exempt from doing those kinds of things.
All right, we'll call it then. All right, thank you, Grant.